Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. As you watch this, the protests in Philly will be raging on, and in the past 2 weeks, we have given you some insight into the law enforcement angle regarding civil disobedience, or, as former Captain Ray Lewis calls it, civil dissent. And if you haven't already, be sure to check that out. But a large part of the law enforcement pie, if you will, indeed what makes much of modern-day policing possible, is the surveillance state. Now, most of you are aware that the NSA can read your emails and listen to your phone calls, access your webcam, your microphone, etc., etc., and special thanks to Edward Snowden for that information. But the NSA is not the only fish in the 1984 pond. The FBI has a long, rich history of spying on U.S. citizens, from MLK to your tattoos. Yeah, your tattoos. It's part of what's called next generation identification, and the DOJ suggested back in May that Americans have no right to know whether or not their fingerprints, our fingerprints, facial images, or tattoos, i.e. biometric identifiers, are being stored by the FBI. Stored, I might add, alongside the fingerprints, tattoos, and facial images of known criminals. As the Bill of Rights Defense Committee put in a press release, images and information of non-criminals would be stored alongside those of criminals, creating a massive trove of biodata that is ripe for abuse and error. Example: oh, we heard that terror plot was hatched by some blonde chick with tattoos on her arm. Yeah, that looks about right. Arrest her. Yay, freedom. And this is just one of the latest privacy trespasses in a long, sordid history of Orwellian ploys. From Hoover's index cards to servers stacked in warehouses, state surveillance has been around for decades. And still today, the focus remains much the same. Use surveillance to promote fear and suspicion, and to disable dissent before it reaches a critical mass. For more on this, we sat down with Chip Gibbons from the Defending Dissent Foundation. Take a look. So a lot of people have this idea that state surveillance didn't really start until the digital age. Is that true?
That's actually not true at all. It's easy when we have, cameras everywhere and we know that people are looking at our emails to think that surveillance is a problem. But the surveillance state has been around for a long time. As Brandy Collins of Color of Change mentioned on the panel I was on last couple weeks ago, that, a lot of the surveillance state practices are rooted in slave patrol. So it goes back a long way. Our organization was founded in 1960, and we were spied on very early on by the FBI, and we were founded to abolish HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. And part of the reason why we came into being was that our founder, Frank Wilkinson, was a employee at the Los Angeles Housing Authority who had been spied on for about 10 years by the FBI. They tracked all his political affiliations, and when he was testifying in an eminent domain trial, the FBI had given his file to the other side, the side for the developers, who then asked him about his political affiliations. He then lost his job and stuff like that. So as you can see, the surveillance has been around for a very long time. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover got his start heading up the Justice Department's Radical Division, which became the FBI. It was also called the General Intelligence Division. And he was keeping index cards on radicals across the country. And these index cards eventually became the custodial detention list, which is a list of people who would be detained in the event of a war or national emergency without habeas corpus. So obviously, we've come a long way from index cards. We have the NSA collecting metadata, and they can do a whole lot more with it, but just what makes it so frightening is when we think about how much they were doing when they just had, the index cards and the low-tech stuff.
So it sounds like the FBI started as sort of surveilling activists. How did the NSA grow out of that?
So the FBI did start surveilling activists. The NSA came out of military and intelligence through an executive order by Truman, and they're supposed to be looking at a signals intelligence and sort of overseas calls. But what we found is that through the Church Committee, they were doing a lot of spying on activists. They monitored Martin Luther King's phone calls when he called overseas. As part of Operation Shamrock, they were collecting all of the telegraphs of people in the United States. The counsel for the Church Committee actually told them, "Don't you know that violates the Fourth Amendment?" And the NSA says, "The Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to the NSA." And he was just sort of like, what? And also with the National Lawyers Guild, which was spied on by the FBI and the CIA as well, for a while the NSA was intercepting all of their overseas calls.
So with that, I mean, obviously you mentioned MLK and he's a very famous activist, but talk about the breadth of surveillance. I mean, what's the threshold? Is it something as simple as going to a march? Would that be enough to put you on under surveillance? And with that, the recent testimony that you gave to the UN on this issue, as I understand, and talk a little bit also how that affects these social movements and participation.
Sure. So there is supposed to be some limits on what the FBI and law enforcement can do. After the Church Committee, there was something put in place called the Attorney General Guidelines, which limits what the FBI can do. They're not supposed to be doing the type of political policing that went on under J. Edgar Hoover. Of course, we know that they are doing it. So while you ask what's the threshold is, I mean, there's one threshold in theory and there's another in fact. For example, we recently found out that the FBI for 10 years, as part of a counterterrorism investigation, spied on and infiltrated the School of the Americas Watch. And they have a permitted march every year. There's also civil disobedience. And as part of their justification, they said they have peaceful intentions, but at an unknown date in the future, unknown people could infiltrate it and they could have their own agenda and use the group for violence, which is like an absurd thing to say, because you could say about any group. A chess club could have an unknown infiltrator at an unknown date in the future with an unknown agenda who could commit an unknown crime. I mean, if we're going down that route, you're just talking mass surveillance. But they tend to single out groups with certain political ideologies. There's an incident a couple years back in Maryland where the Maryland police was spying on anti-death penalty groups, and they sent an infiltrator in who went to their meetings, and they put the names of the people in the Northeast Regional Terrorist and Drug Trafficker database. So, I mean, obviously there should be a threshold beyond, like, being against the death penalty, but there's not a lot of accountability with local or federal law enforcement, and that's part of what I told the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the freedom to peaceful assembly and association earlier this week, is that while the United States has a First Amendment and it protects the free association and peaceful assembly, we have a problem with government surveillance, we have a problem with government infiltration. And they go into these groups because of their political or religious ideology, which means they're substituting suspicion of a crime with political ideology, which means they think that certain ideologies are in themselves suspect. And that while the First Amendment should prevent this, at nearly every level of government and every branch of government, there's been a dereliction of duty to uphold free association. So, for example, the Supreme Court in the early 70s threw out a lawsuit brought by anti-war activists who were surveilled by the military in D.C. for peaceful protest, not on the grounds that it was okay under the First Amendment. They didn't even decide that issue. They just decided they didn't even have standing to bring the case, because in order to bring a lawsuit, you have to show a harm, and that a deprivation of a constitutional right is always an irreparable harm. But, they said the activists, by saying they were less likely to protest, that wasn't the government's fault. That was their own subjective chill, and that as a result, they had no tangible harm beyond a subjective chill. So this is an example of something that I think every, reasonable person understands poses a huge threat to free association. Like, if you're going to be suspected of a crime, if you march down the street with a sign, I think most people don't want to be investigated, by the FBI or by the police. But yet the Supreme Court says, oh, there's no effect on free speech here. You can't even challenge whether or not this violates the First Amendment, which is a very shocking decision. But that was, 40 years ago when the court was a whole bunch more civil libertarian than it was now.
Yeah, I mean, that's like saying that the 4-hour lines outside of a voting booth isn't like a problem to get people to vote. Like, oh, it's just, I mean, if you want to vote badly enough, you'll just do it.
Yeah, it's that type of argument. I think most people realize those are, absurd arguments. They just don't happen to be on the Supreme Court, most reasonable people.
Unfortunately. So a recent report just came out about the FBI greenlighting crackdowns on Black Lives Matter protesters. Several have been arrested for peacefully protesting or put in jail with astonishingly high bail. So how does this most recent event fold into the surveillance state tactics? And what do you expect the response to be from the Black Lives Matter movement?
So I can't speak for the Black Lives Matter movement. I would let them speak for themselves. But the article you're referring to appeared in Alternate this week. It's by an attorney from the Partnership for Civil Justice, which does a lot of great work through FOIA. And she was referencing a specific FBI document that was sent to the Baton Rouge police, warning them about riots and violence. And of course, there was no riots or violence, but there was a police crackdown on protests. And I believe the point that she was making was that when the FBI sends these sort of inflammatory warnings like, beware of these crazy people, they might commit violence, local law enforcement then overreacts. And one of the things that the Partnership for Civil Justice, they're the group that discovered the FBI documents about School of the America Watch, and that they used to have a much better relationship with local police. But once the FBI started their counterterrorism investigation, local police started treating them much differently. So while a lot of the repression comes at the local level, the FBI sets the agenda at the top.
So in that same, and just thinking about that, how does the FBI sending these sort of memos, how does that affect the rise of the militarized police and cops showing up in riot gear? Is there a direct link there?
I don't know if there's a direct link. I can't speak to specific causality, but I think we could logically say that if the FBI sends you a memo and you already have the military gear saying to watch out for violence and anarchists and rioting, you're probably going to be more likely to bring out the military gear if the FBI sends you a memo, peaceful protesters coming.
Right. So on Defending Dissent has a section that speaks about this idea: activism is not terrorism. Talk a little bit more about that campaign and the ideas behind it.
So Activism is not terrorism is one of our main campaigns. It is dedicated to challenging the use of terrorism as a pretext to curtail First Amendment rights, either through repressive legislation that conflates civil disobedience with terrorism, or through using the fear of terrorism to monitor activist groups. It has several parts. One part of it is our Investigate the FBI campaign. We initiated a letter that was signed by over 60 civil society groups asking Congress to investigate the FBI, using its counterterrorism authority to spy on groups like Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, School of the Americas Watch. The other element of it right now is we're very concerned with ag-gag laws, which are laws that are used to criminalize whistleblowing on factory farms. And a lot of times the legislators will get up in the state legislatures and say, oh, these undercover animal rights activists are terrorists. And the other part of that is we're also challenging the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which elevates very sort of, nonviolent crimes to the level of federal terrorism. So the only people who have ever been charged under it and convicted have been people who've freed mink from a fur farm, and they were charged, not with destruction of property or theft on the state level. They were charged with federal animal enterprise terrorism charges. So that is an example of, conflating low-level crimes that are politically motivated with terrorism.
So switching gears slightly, Islamophobia, I know it was discussed on the panel, but I just want to ask you, as it pertains to the surveillance state, how has the surveillance state contributed to the rise of this national Islamophobia, and how have they dodged civil rights in order to do so?
So in addition to our Activism is Not Terrorism campaign, we have a Countering Islamophobia campaign, and what it focuses on is the role of the state in fostering Islamophobia in the United States. There is a rise in Islamophobia, but it's not just happening in a vacuum. It's not just that your neighbor woke up one day and had bad ideas. It's that the FBI is sending informants into mosques across the country. It's that the FBI is entrapping Muslims. It's that the FBI considers, your religion to be suspicion of a crime in of itself. And that when the FBI starts to engage in these kinds of behaviors, it sends a larger signal to society as a whole that there's something about being a Muslim that makes you inherently suspicious. Just as we know that when they use political speech as a proxy for crime, it conflates speech with crime. When they do the same thing for religion, it has the same effect. And the flip side of that is not only does the FBI engage in these sorts of surveillance, which they then use Islamophobia to justify, the Islamophobia then justifies more surveillance, of course.
So moving on from that, I know that you said that it's important to understand that we still do have rights and we should still go out and protest, because the more we protest, the more we protect the rights that we still have. So debunk this idea, because you hear it a lot of times, well, I'm not an activist and I'm not doing anything wrong, so I have nothing to hide, so I don't really care if they spy on me. Debunk that idea.
You have a right to privacy. Privacy is a basic human right. The government doesn't need to know everything that you're doing. And, we're a democracy. free speech and dissent are important to a democracy. If people are afraid to express their opinions because they're afraid the government will spy on them, what kind of a democracy do we have left over then? You're not doing anything wrong. Well, do you want to live in a democratic society or not? Is, I think, the flip question.
So, and that sort of tips me off to this idea, the politics of fear, people people voting a certain way because they're afraid, or people not protesting because they're afraid. What's the antidote to that?
I mean, I think the solution is to organize people and to sort of, point out how these policies aren't about keeping you safe. They're about repressing free speech. It's not just that free speech is a casualty of an earnest effort to keep us all safe. It's that they want to repress free speech, and they're using your fear of terrorism to legitimize their actions.
So with that, how can social movements work around the surveillance state or combat the surveillance state while they're working on their particular issue?
That's a great question. I think that if we have any hope in combating the surveillance state, it's through social movements. I mean, in the 1970s, we see really the only major attempts to reform the surveillance state. We see the Church Committee, we see new laws passed. And the reason why that happened, I think, is because you had very large-scale social movements like the anti-war movement, the Black liberation struggle, and these movements recognized that the FBI and these groups were a threat to them. And they saw part of their ability to achieve their goals of ending the war, of achieving racial justice, as also taking on these institutions that want to stop them. And I think when you have powerful social movements that see the connection between their causes and achieving their causes and eroding the surveillance state, as well as seeing a common ally in other movements, I think that creates enough powerful groundswell that you can actually start to combat the surveillance state.
So basically, like, enough people, like, building these social movements.
Yes. And I know that's sort of nebulous and it sounds hard, but, I mean, it's not going to be easy taking on, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, your local police, and DHS.
Yeah, well, and justice takes time. I mean, we've seen that everything from the civil rights movement to the environmental movement. Like, it's not, a flip doesn't get switched and then, all of a sudden, yes, the world's a better place. So I want to ask, like, this is sort of a devil's advocate question, but is there such a thing as good surveillance?
I mean, there's no such thing as good political surveillance. I suppose if you're trying to track down a serial killer and you have adequate evidence that this person is likely to be a serial killer and you engage in some sort of limited surveillance to achieve that, I mean, I suppose surveillance has a place in, policing crime. Mass surveillance is unacceptable, suspicionless surveillance is unacceptable, and surveillance of political and religious movements is entirely unacceptable, but, I mean, there's a limited place for it as a law enforcement tactic in a legitimate criminal investigation, I think.
So this sort of ties into my last question about what sort of laws or legislation would you like to see passed, but so do you think that having organizations like the NSA and the FBI are necessary then, or is this like sort of like a local police thing of doing the job of surveillance?
My concern is with civil liberties. I don't think it's my job to tell us what the best law enforcement strategies are. If these agencies can't conduct themselves in a way that respects civil liberties, then I don't think they need to be doing anything at all. Whether or not certain crimes are best solved on the state level or the federal level or the local level, that's something that's, outside of my area of expertise.
So do you have like a list of, like, defending dissent, do you guys have like a list of legislation or laws that you'd like to see passed to protect the civil liberties in terms of the surveillance state?
So we take positions on bills as they come up. Our predecessor organization in the early 90s worked very hard to get something called the FBI First Amendment Protection Act passed, and that barred the FBI from investigating First Amendment activity without reasonable suspicion of a crime. It never passed, but it did pass as an amendment to the 1994 Violent Crime Prevention Act, and it was repealed 16 months later by the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. I think if you had laws in place that limited law enforcement to investigating crime, and I think that we have local legislation on our website that you could, model legislation you could pass in your community, and it would limit law enforcement from investigating First Amendment activity unless they had a warrant based on probable cause of a crime. So I think stuff like that would be good first steps in sort of reining in these agencies.
So finally, I want to ask, like, this is always the question. Like, you pass legislation or you basically rein in these agencies, but how do you make sure that they're not overstepping their bounds and that they're sticking to the regulations that you've passed?
I mean, this is a huge problem. We see this with the FBI. The FBI is regulated, post 70s by the Attorney General's guidelines, which are supposed to prevent them from investigating politics. They should be investigating terrorism, crime, espionage, stuff like that. And what we see is that the FBI carried on many of its same investigations, like it's one into the Black Panther Party or the Communist Party. They just use their new authorities to do so. So there is a tendency that, you limit what the FBI or the police can do, and they find a way to try to justify what they're doing. So, I mean, the really only answer is to just be vigilant about what they're doing and hold them accountable when they overstep their positions.
For more on the Defending Dissent Foundation, visit bordc.org.